I'm very glad I brought my out of focus dying flowers too. They look really good there.
You'll never tell that they're dying.
I know, they're out of focus. My name is Juliana Laury, and today I'm going to show you how to play with a material called Encaustic. This is Encaustic medium. It is a mixture of beeswax and damar resin. You'll find it sold as bags of pellets like this or in small blocks. R&F is the company. It's sold through Amazon, any art supplier such as Dick Blick here in Philadelphia, even Walmart. It's very easy to find online. I personally purchased the bags of pellets. They come in 1, 2, 5, and 10-pound bags. I keep the 5-pound bags here in the studio. It runs me at about $22 per pound when I buy it that way. Now, as you can see here, the pellets that I buy don't have a pigment in them, but you can buy small blocks with pigment included. I'd say try to stick to R&F for the brand of these, but they do have off brands. They can run from $20 to $75 each, depending on the size and color of the block. When I use these, I can extend the life of the block by mixing in some of the transparent materials. The pellets, it's kind of like adding water. The more you add, the lighter it'll get, but it is very highly concentrated, so just kind of bear that in mind. Now, this is a solid, and we need to turn it into a liquid. The melting point is 145 degrees. I personally use a cheap pancake griddle. You really just need a flat, hot surface you aren't worried about ruining. Now, this can get messy, and while you can scrape the wax off, it's really best to have a designated surface to play with. So when I started, I used disposable bread pans that you find at the grocery store, which is the cheapest and easiest option. I also really liked that they were malleable, so they kind of helped me to create a spout, like this. There are different kinds of bread pans, and there are pans with a flat edge like this. I would avoid using these. They splash more, and again, you're playing with a very hot liquid. You can use little saucepans like this. You want to look for spout on the side if possible. You can get cheap ones from a thrift store or from Amazon. This is a little thrift store saucepan that I found, and this is an Amazon purchase that I made. But the added benefit, of course, is going to be the handle. Now, if you do use the bread pans, please protect your fingers with little silicone grippers like this. These are easy dollar store, grocery store, or Amazon finds if you don't already have them. So, you pour or place the encaustic medium into your container and turn on your griddle. Give it about 10 to 15 minutes to go from a solid to a liquid. During that time, you can set up the rest of your station. Now, you want to remember, this is a messy process, especially the way that I do it. Please use drop cloths and wear an apron if you can. Definitely do not wear your favorite shirt or shoes. I've totally spilled wax on my sneakers before when I wasn't paying attention, and the wax really doesn't come out. You can scrape it off, but there's still a spot there. So you should be wearing painting clothes, art clothes, whatever you want to call them. I started out with cloth drop cloths, and I discovered that, as I said, the spills really don't come out of the fabric like this. I recently switched to plastic drop cloths, and I like them much better. After the wax hardens, I can peel it back up and reuse it. It looks like this. It's way less waste, and it's also way less mess. So it is right next to Lowe's in the drop cloth section. They're right next to one another. Try to go for the plastic one. So here is where we'll talk about my particular process and how it's different from the way that this substance is normally used. As I mentioned, the medium is typically used as a painting medium, and that is how I learned how to use it. I was a photography major in college, and a woman named Leah McDonald gave us a demonstration on how she fuses her photographs with encaustic medium. Highly recommend you look her up. She's probably the most prominent encaustic artist in my area. Now, I was immediately hooked, and post-graduation, I stayed in touch with her. I took more private lessons in her studio. And for years, this is actually how I used it. I used it as a medium to paint over my photographs. This is something that I did for years in my spare bedroom. In my home, I was just playing. I would integrate fabrics and oil sticks, and it was just so fun. It was like a collage project for me. You can totally use it this way. All kinds of fabric like this, like lace. Just Google search encaustic paintings and you'll find no shortage of examples. Typically, the photograph or painting is done on a wood board like this, and you can find specific encaustic boards as well to work on. Now, I had a ton of fun doing this, but I am me, and I'm constantly thinking outside the box. So here's how I went from this to this. I'm going to show you what I'm doing now, but you will see it is really all just play. The supplies are easy to find, and there is no experience or skill necessary to do this. We are just playing with flowers and wax, and that's it. So grab a handful of flowers or whatever material that you find in your backyard that you'd like to use. Look for things with some shape, different texture, different color, and lay it right next to your piece. You just want to clip off a few little stems and work one piece at a time just to build a composition and see what feels right. Keep in mind that whatever you place at the bottom is going to sink and isn't going to be as visible, especially if it's very delicate and very thin. Bigger pieces that have a little bit more depth are going to rise above the wax. They may change and dry over time, but they're going to be a little bit more substantial in your composition. It's okay to keep your materials next to you, and don't forget to use your silicone holders when you're picking up the bread pan that's provided. So this first demonstration shows the method of putting your flowers or your material inside of the hoop before you pour. Now, we're going to see a student trying it out, and she's going to actually pour the wax before she puts any of her flowers inside of it. And doing that system will probably help you control your wax a little bit better, but you will have a different system of filling in the space. So what Kenzie's doing here is she's just holding down the hoop, and she's just allowing the wax to set. It'll help avoid any spillage like how I had outside of the hoop. And it's allowing it to just sort of harden along the edges a tiny bit. The wax is a hot 300-degree liquid, so it's going to be good for you to have some kind of tool to just poke around with while keeping your hands safe. Whether you use a knife or an art tool, whatever you need, just something to press your pieces down, it's always good to have on hand. As you can see, the wax will start to harden, and as it does so, certain materials will probably start to resist the wax. You just want to be a little bit mindful of the whole process. You have to kind of like work quickly. So now that it's starting to harden and you can kind of see this, you can actually just hold it down because it is still hot. So let's just say you're like, oh, I'm kind of unhappy with this. You would probably want to just take something that's maybe dried, a dried element, and actually just start kind of covering it up, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
and just kind of like pressing it in. The dried materials work a lot better with the wax when it's in that in-between state of being between a liquid and a solid. So at this point, the wax, it has changed color completely. So it's gone from a liquid to a solid. It's safe for you to actually use your fingers at this point, and this is when you would want to start pressing. And just be gentle, but I like to use my fingers. Kenzie is using a plastic pipette. It's just allowing her to create these little drips of wax all over the surface. You can buy these on Amazon. They're probably $4 for 100 of them. The one thing we'll say though is they are single use. So once the wax has solidified inside of the pipette, you can't use it anymore. So get the 100 back. When you feel like you're done, you just want to let it dry off a little bit and let it cool down. The last detail is we can also always add something like gold foil or like gold powder or something like that to add some color. So this is edible powder. You can get it actually in the baking section, and I just use an old makeup brush. Kind of gives a little bit of interest and highlight. Plus it's just fun to play with. Doesn't look
shiny.
So good with the gold.
Yeah.
That's fun.
What should you do if like this piece is kind of like loose?
You would want to press that in completely. So again, like you kind of just can't be afraid. So I would actually use both of my fingers. The wax is still soft.
Oh, okay.
And this is a dried material.
Okay.
So as I'm pressing it in, like don't be afraid to like use your fingers. You can actually feel it You can feel it like going in. So it is because it's like that sort of semi-soft place, you can be really kind of rough with it.
Cool.
Ta-da. So for this one, I'm gonna show you just taking an old vintage frame that I found at a thrift store and the difference between using a hoop and a found frame. So we're gonna do the method where we pour the encaustic first just to make sure that it goes around the frames. Whenever it's a vintage frame and it's a little bit uneven, you just have to know there's gonna be some spillage. So the nice thing about frames is that you can use bigger pieces, you can use dried fruit, and you could use flowers that have some depth. So think about the frame as a shadow box. Imagine you're taking a shadow box that you got at Michael's or something, and you're just filling that shadow box with wax. You're able to actually create a three-dimensional piece. Something that I love to do with vintage frames is use objects that I wouldn't use, like bark or fruit. I like to use rougher natural objects. This is a mushroom. I love using mushrooms in frames, grapevine wreaths, any kind of enclosure that has a little bit of depth to it. I love using things like moss, dried natural objects. This is an acorn, same thing, you can start layering. You can pour a little bit more wax and just see how you can build a three-dimensional structure. One of the nice things about dried nature is that you do know that when it comes out of the frame, if it's actually outside of the four walls, it will probably stay. But play with that. Play with working outside of the four walls. Start letting your piece kind of come off the edge because then it creates something that's a lot more interesting. Always start with your corners. Corners are always great. And let your corners become a focal point. All of my favorite pieces have a lot of dimension to them. They have dried elements that are sticking out and that are emerging from the wax. So play with that. Play with working outside of the box, literally. And I clearly have no game plan, but I'm just seeing where it takes me. Whenever you work within corners, try to have one corner be open. Give your composition one area of breathing room so that if it's really busy on the left side, it's a little bit calmer and a little bit less crowded on the right side. So you can see that the wax is really starting to solidify now. You can watch it change color. So this is the point when you can really press your pieces. Just make sure everything is secure. So vintage frames and fully dried compositions always look great together because the color palette is what we see with our eye. And it feels a little bit nostalgic even though we can't explain what it is about a dried piece of moss and an old wood frame that go so well together, but they just do. So one thing about this process is that if it makes a little bit of a spill, you can scrape it up, but you really should just embrace the imperfections. I'm going to test the back, so I'm just going to lift the frame and I'm just going to start pulling this parchment paper away very slowly. It's not ready because you can see that there are little chunks that are actually peeling off. So I need to give this a few more minutes to set. So you'll notice that there's a small hole in the back from one of the pieces. I'm gonna just leave it as is. Again, vintage frame. It's imperfect. This whole process is imperfect. You can go in and fill that with a little bit more wax if you'd like to. You might create a little bit of spillage, but in general, 90%, 99% of the back is filled in, so I'm going to let it go. If you don't know where to start, think about these three starting pieces. Green, focal flower, and an accent flower. This is a combination that all florists use for their arrangements. They usually start with building their compositions, whether it's a bouquet or a centerpiece, filling in their greens. And then they think of what's the biggest, thickest flower that I'm going to be adding, put that in next. And then the last piece is adding small, delicate focal flowers, accent flowers, anything that has a little bit of a shape to it. So we're gonna do a composition that actually shows this. It's gonna show the process of just filling a frame with greens. As we saw, My personal approach is to put the greens into the frame first. I enjoy having a base layer, so I'm just gonna load this frame up with a lot of green. I know it's gonna sink into the background of the wax. So I placed my green, and what I'm going to do is actually pour the wax. So I'm at the point now where I'm just going to put one layer in at a time. So while my greens are sizzling and the wax is still hot, I'm going to cut my focal flower. And since I've only chosen to just do one focal flower that's purple, I'm going to start doing small little accent flowers that are the same color, just to carry your eye around. And I'm going to go back to this same pink piece, pull the stems off, and start building that way. Now remember, this wax dries very quickly. So since I'm figuring it out as I go along, I'm just placing the flowers knowing that I can press them down into the wax later. I'm just giving myself a starting point before the wax actually hardens. Once it's hard, I can press these flowers a little bit harder into the wax. I have absolutely no game plan. The only thing that I always look for is a good shape. I always look for something that has a curve to it, something that gives your eye a little interest, like this. And then once you have your shape, something that has a bend to it, then you can start playing with color. And now I'm just filling in the gaps. These pink flowers are fresh flowers. That means that they will dry and change if they are not covered in wax. So I have two choices to make. I can either use something like a pipette and do little drips of wax to seal sections off, or I can leave it as is, wait for this to dry a little bit, press them in, and then spray seal it. You can get a floral protectant like this in any hardware store, Lowe's, Amazon. And again, this is something that florists will use. This is in the event that your fresh flowers might change and you don't want them to change color. You can start to protect them this way. So while I'm waiting at this point for the wax to keep solidifying, I'm going to just use my fingers, or I'm going to use a tool like this one and just poke the flowers so that they go a little bit deeper into the wax. I want them as submerged as possible to preserve them. One thing I try to encourage with my students is to open the petals of the flower. When you first drop it into the wax, it sort of balls itself up, but press each petal and just see where it wants to go and open your flower just a little bit. That'll help show which flower this is rather than it just looking like a big ball. If I'm not sure if I want to add something or not, I might hover a piece. Without pressing it into the composition, I might just move it around. You can see if I want to add another element without committing to it, just by playing with it visually this way. You can even place it, just drop it, see how it looks, pick it back up. I've decided I do like this, so I'm going to add it. And at this point, the wax is a little bit soft in the center, but it is hardening at the edges. So I'm going to focus on adding to the center and working my way out. You can also see that I'm sticking with a specific color palette here, and that's what's helping make my decision to add this additional pink piece. I'm like genuinely having fun with this one. So I purchased a cheap gold leaf on Amazon, and I love playing with this material. Sometimes I just press it in with my fingers and I dab it, and sometimes I drag it along the edge, but I always find that it adds some really nice interest to the piece. It feels like that final touch that finishes it and makes it a little bit extra special. Here are some samples of the work that I've done, just to show you how varied this process has become. I've made floating pieces on glass, inside grapevine wreaths. I've even used old frames that I took the mirror out of. The sky is the limit. Let mistakes lead you to new discoveries. It is a medium that isn't perfect, and I haven't perfected it yet, and I never will. Every flower reacts differently. If the petals are soft, they will melt. Something as delicate as a peony will sizzle and burn inside the wax. Or something more robust, like wheat, dried straw flowers, those hold up. If you insert live materials, they may change color as they dry, but then some don't, like forget-me-nots as an example. Sometimes I use silicone molds that you can buy in the baking section of a store, and I actually pour wax into these. I can create 3-dimensional sculptures which allow for me to use deep frames or boxes. I call these creations floral daydreams because that's what they are to me. They are never planned out. I just start with some materials and play with some music and see what happens. This practice is about letting go, and that's what I love about it. Play with layers, try different materials, and just let yourself be inspired by something as simple as a walk outside. See what you can bring in, add wax to, and hang in your home. Just try it.